These enemies are not in Kansas anymore, Toto. Oh, I'm the dog. Ladies, gentlemen, and Haradrim of all ages, this recent patch has been absolutely wonderful for the health of the game, and as a Druid main, I cannot help but feel like we got a lot of love here, honestly. Obviously, they didn't nerf our strongest stuff, which is important, but they did buff some of the side stuff, and a lot of you Druids out there may well be asking, what is the strongest build now after this patch? Has anything majorly changed for the top end? Well, if you want the purely best in every aspect, it is still Wolfnado, the Werewolf Tornado build, but I've made some changes since the last time I've shown it to you, and then even some further changes thanks to this patch that I think have really taken this build to a whole different level. I'll start by saying the old version of this build was really successful. People used it to clear tier 100 nightmare dungeons. It was the Druid build that killed Uber Lilith, but it had one big glaring issue where the potential for damage was insane, but it was relatively inconsistent at reaching that potential as it relied heavily on Earth and Might procs to make the actual damage windows really sing. Obviously, when they did, when you got procs back to back to back, it was insanity, but there comes a point where having ridiculous burst damage with a heavy RNG component is sort of an overkill, sort of almost a downside. And speaking of downsides, be careful when checking loot in the middle of a nightmare dungeon. It makes you weaker because when the procs don't come, you don't have much going for you. So my goals with adjusting the build were simply to even out the experience as a whole, to keep it being as insanely strong as it is as a build fundamentally, working off of the same core, but to lower the power ceiling just a little bit in order to significantly raise the power floor. The result is something I'm going to call Cronado Wolf. No, it's not a crow thing. We aren't using the Raven companions, but we are using the Greatstaff of the Crone unique. As you can see in the footage, this version of the build is decking anything it touches anyways. It has insanely good spirit generation, which is really important. It still crits a ton to build up our Grizzly Rage damage window. It still hits ludicrously quickly, which builds up armor stacks from Disobedience really effectively for defense, but it is just much more consistent across the board. That said, let's break down this build as a whole. We'll talk about the skill point allocation and what has changed with that in regards to the patch. We will go over the spirit boons that you want to take for this. We'll talk about the legendaries and uniques that I'm using, as well as any potential substitutes for ones that you do not have. Then we'll talk about the gearing strat in general, what stats and affixes you want to aim for on your equipment, and really pump it up to make the build better. Then we'll dive into the whole Paragon board that I've got going, followed finally by some tips on how to play the build efficiently from my time spent with it so far. Without further ado then, for your basic skills, because we are using Crone, we're actually going to take two full basic skills. We put one rank into Claw, one rank into Enhanced Claw to increase his attack speed by 10%, then we take Wild Claw for a 15% chance to attack twice when you attack with Claw in general. On top of this, Claw got some meaty buffs in the patch, getting a 10% damage increase to its base damage, as well as getting slightly increased spirit generation, and that 15% chance to attack twice actually used to only be 10%, so that's a pretty good buff too. We also take one rank of Storm Strike, an attack that chains to multiple enemies, and also reduces the damage that you take by 25% for 3 seconds after it hits an enemy. Enhanced Storm Strike gives it a 15% chance to immobilize enemies that are hit for 2.5 seconds, and then Fierce Storm Strike gives it a 50% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds, which is nuts. That's extremely consistent vulnerability application. This is massive for our single target output, as we can keep vulnerable pretty much permanently active on bosses using this. The beauty of this is we only actually need to have Claw on our bar itself. Because of the unique, it will trigger Storm Strike automatically when you use it, which is fantastic. Moving on to our core skill node cluster then, we of course take the full 5 ranks of Tornado, as this is our main skill of the build. On top of which, any bonus ranks that you can get from gloves are incredibly important too. Then we get Enhanced Tornado, which gives us a 20% chance to spawn a bonus tornado when cast, and Primal Tornado, which gives us a stacking slowing effect against an enemy whenever it hits them. Of course, after that, we want to get a bunch of passives in this cluster, one rank of Heart of the Wild, which gives us 3 bonus maximum spirit, but that's mostly just a gateway to put 3 points into Wild Impulses, which increases the spirit cost of core skills by 9%, but the damage of them by 15%, which is really positive. I have a bonus 3 ranks in this from my amulet as well, which I think is great to have, essentially doubling what this passive does. On top of that, we take 3 ranks of Predatory Instinct for 6% increased critical chance on close enemies, which is great, especially now that we are using a melee basic skill and no longer using Earth and Might, so crit chance is more relevant than it was in the old version of the build. And we also take 3 ranks of Digitigrade Gate for 9% bonus move speed while in in werewolf form and for 3 seconds after exiting it. In the defensive skill node cluster then, we put 1 point into cyclone armor itself for its passive 10% non-physical damage reduction. It also has an active component that knocks enemies back and does damage. Enhanced cyclone armor makes the knockback of the active also slow enemies by 70% for 2 seconds, and then preserving cyclone armor gives you a 30% damage reduction for 2 seconds after you take damage on a 10-second internal cooldown, so essentially just once every 10 seconds of combat, you get extra tanky for a few seconds. Then we take Blood Howl, Enhanced Blood Howl, and then also Preserving Blood Howl. Altogether with that, this ability heals you for 20% of your maximum health when you activate it, and gives you a bonus 15% attack speed for 4 seconds. By default, the cooldown of this is 15 seconds, but it gets reduced by 1 second every time that you kill an enemy, so you can make this essentially active every few seconds in a dense enough pack of enemies too. After that, we grab 1 rank of Ancestral Fortitude for 5% increased non-physical damage reduction, and then 3 ranks of Vigilance, which gives you a 15% damage reduction for 6 seconds after using a defensive skill. We have 2 defensive skills, one of which with a very low cooldown in effective combat, so you can keep this damage reduction active pretty consistently.
I'm a tank.
After that, we completely skip the companion skill node cluster and move on to the Wrath cluster, where we grab Hurricane, which just puts a nice circle of damage around you while it's active for its duration. The damage of this skill was boosted by about 30% in the patch, so while we mostly use it for the effect of its enhancements, this buff just passively slightly increases our damage. Past that, then we take Enhanced Hurricane, which slows enemies caught in the circle by 25%, and then also Savage Hurricane, which reduces the damage of enemies within the radius by 20%, which is another massive tankiness increase for us. Past that, we take a fair few passives in this cluster as well, 3 ranks of Elemental Exposure to give our storm magic attacks a 10% lucky hit chance to apply vulnerable to enemies for 3 seconds, 1 rank of the Neurotoxin passive as well, to give poisoned enemies a slow debuff, but this mostly acts as a gateway to let us put 1 point into Toxic Claws, which has our werewolf skill critical hits, which does include Tornado, Hurricane, Cyclone Armor, and Storm Strike in this build, apply 8% of their damage as poison to enemies over 4 seconds, and then 3 points into Envenom, which boosts our crit damage by 30% against poisoned enemies. Extra meaningful because this is a 30% crit damage multiplier, not just additive crit damage. Then moving on to the ultimate skill node cluster, we are of course here grabbing Grizzly Rage. This by default is a bear skill, but we are using the direwolf aspect to make it a wolf skill. We of course also take the enhancements, and altogether this makes this skill transform you into a dire werewolf, get a 20% multiplier to your damage in general while active, which actually increases by 3% every second that the skill is active, as well as increasing our movement speed by 25% and reducing our spirit cost by 50%. You have Unstoppable while this is active, so crowd control effects cannot affect you, and you also fortify for 8% of your health every second. On top of this, the duration of the skill is extended by 1 second for every kill that you get within it, up to a maximum bonus of a 5-second extension. In this cluster, we also grab a few passives too, 3 ranks of Defiance, which gives you a 12% increased damage multiplier with nature magic damage against elites, 1 rank of Circle of Life for a 1% max life heal when you cast Tornado, and then Resonance for 6% bonus damage multiplier to nature magic skills. There is a secondary effect here that has to do with earth skills, but we don't use those, just look at this as a 6% increased damage multiplier. That's simple, but it's very good. Then we also grab 3 ranks of Defensive Posture for 15% increased fortified generation from all sources, just to increase our tankiness just a touch. Finally, we get to our key passive today, and here we are actually taking Perfect Storm. This is one of the main differences of this build. This key passive gives you 15% increased damage multiplier to storm skills when they deal damage to vulnerable, immobilized, or slowed enemies, as well as giving you 1 spirit when this happens too. All of our storm skills apply slows. We also try to keep enemies vulnerable as much as possible. Storm Strike also has an immobilized chance on it too, so this bonus is essentially active on every single bit of our damage. That's it for the skill tree then, so let's have a look at our spirit boons. First, of course, we take Wariness in the Deer Path for 10% reduced damage taken from elites. Then in the Eagle Path, we grab Avian Wrath, which is a 30% increased crit damage multiplier. Again, multiplicative boosts are really important, so this is pretty irreplaceable, honestly. Then we grab Calamity in the Wolf Path for 25% increased ultimate duration, and then we bond with the Snake Path so that we can take both Masochistic, which heals you for 3% of your maximum health every time you crit with a shapeshifting skill, which does count for all of our storm skills in this build too, and then we can also grab Calm Before the Storm for a 10% lucky hit chance with nature magic skills to reduce the cooldown of our ultimate skills by 2 seconds, which is how we get reasonably high uptime on Grizzly Rage itself.
I'm always angry.
With that then, let's look at our gear, starting with Legendaries and Uniques. Of course, this build does use Tempest Roar. It is an anchor of many of the strongest current Druid builds. You just can't really actually activate them without it. it, not only making your storm skills count as wolf and shapeshift skills as well, but also giving you a lucky hit chance to generate spirit every time you hit with them, which is fantastic self-fueling action. We also use the Greatstaff of the Crone in this version of the build, hence the name Croneado Wolf. This makes it so anytime that you cast Claw, you also cast Storm Strike at up to 150% effectiveness. It also gives you a ton of bonus ranks to Claw, as well as having bonus damage to close and crowd-controlled enemies, which isn't bad at all. Even though it isn't the ideal weapon stats that you necessarily want to have, they're still decent enough. On top of this, we of course have the Direwolf legendary that we talked about earlier to transform your Grizzly Rage into a wolf skill with all the other bonuses it has too, as well as the Rampaging Werebeast aspect to really make Grizzly Rage pump out extra damage. This increases the duration of the skill, but more importantly gives you a stacking buff while Grizzly Rage is active, where anytime that you get a critical hit, your critical damage is increased by 10%, which is actually a multiplier, so that is nuts. Every time you crit, this increases, so the actual modifier can get really silly by the last few seconds of Grizzly Rage. Then I would recommend putting the Retaliation aspect on your amulet for a 50% boost to its power. In this slot, it gives you up to 60% increased damage as a multiplier, depending on how much Fortify that you have at any given time, which is part of why we have the passive skill that increases our Fortify generation going as well. We will also take the Storm Chaser aspect, of course, which makes your Tornado actually actively seek out enemies 1 to 3 depending on the roll, which is incredibly necessary for this build, as without that, tornadoes just have sort of a mind of their own, which is extremely unhelpful, honestly. Aside from that, on our boots we have the Ghost Walker aspect, which gives us a 25% movement speed increase and the invaluable ability to walk through enemies while we are unstoppable, and for 4 seconds after being unstoppable as well. Then for our defensive legendary slots, we have Disobedience, of course. This is a silly strong legendary effect defensively, which at a maximum roll boosts your armor by up to 0.5% per stack, up to a maximum of 50% armor increase. This is one of the few actual builds in the game that stacks hits fast enough to consistently reach maximum stacks of Disobedience, which is incredible to actually accomplish, and it makes a really big difference to your tankiness. Then of course our other defensive aspect is Vigorous. This increases your damage reduction by up to 15% when in werewolf form, and we are always in werewolf form in combat with this build. That's all the aspects for my version of the build then, but I will say that this still totally works even without the Greatstaff of the Crone. So if you want to try that version of the build, essentially just relocate your claw skill points into Ancestral Fortitude and Toxic Claws. Then you want a one-handed axe and a totem, one of which will have the accelerating aspect, which boosts your attack speed by up to 25% for 5 seconds after getting a critical hit with a core skill. And then I'd actually recommend the aspect of the Tempest, which you can see over here. This increases the damage of Hurricane by 7 up to 15% on a good roll per second while it is active, of course increasing the longer that Hurricane is active, so the later seconds of Hurricane are actually a lot of damage with this. This is a multiplier to Hurricane damage, and after the buff that Hurricane got in the patch, this can actually stack to some quite high levels of damage in its own right. As far as general gearing then, the affixes and stats that you want to aim for most on your gear, crit chance is a must for the build. Without Earthen Might, you need ways to give yourself more crits to really fuel your Grizzly Rage damage window, so aim for crit chance on your rings as much as you physically can, as well as on your gloves too. Crit chance against injured enemies is really good as well, as you can get both of these skills together, which makes it even better. On top of this, on your gloves you want maximum bonus ranks of Tornado, as this is our main damage skill, and the damage of the skill itself is what gets boosted by all your multipliers to make it really soar. So the higher the base damage of Tornado, obviously the better. Past this, you want a bit of maximum life increase, but not a crazy amount. A couple of armor percent increases wherever you can get them, as they're quite good, but even more importantly than that is armor percent increase in werewolf form, because this can roll double the potential of just percent armor in general. So aim for that stat ideally, as we are in werewolf form 99% of the time anyways. You of course want crit damage as well as vulnerable damage. Damage with core skills is good, physical damage is good, spirit cost reduction is good, as that just means more tornadoes obviously, then just general damage bonuses, but if you get an amulet with a good passive rolled on it too, that is just extremely solid. I'm a big fan of having bonus ranks to wild impulses myself. That's it for gear in general, so let's take a deeper dive into our Paragon board over here. I currently have just reached what will likely be my final board, which is quite a lot of progress now, really getting close to the end here. And of course on the starting board you want to take the right path to begin with so that you can get the damage bonus rare glyph, which is just really nice to have, then head directly into the glyph socket over here. Then you want to put in the territorial glyph. This boosts your damage against close enemies for every 5 dexterity purchased in the area, and also gives you bonus damage reduction from close enemies, so mop up all the dexterity in the radius too. Then you want to climb up the left side of it to grab another damage increasing rare node, and then head to the board connection gate over here, and you want to put the ancestral guidance board here with the legendary power in the bottom left side. Then you want to take the left path here, grabbing the rare node reclamation along the way for bonus maximum spirit and spirit on kill, and then also drop down to get the legendary note itself. Ancestral Guidance gives you 30% increased damage bonus multiplier for 5 seconds after you spend 75 spirit. This happens every time you spend 75 spirit. It doesn't stack, sadly, but you do reset the actual 5-second duration, so you can essentially just have this active permanently for just 30% increased damage, which is nuts. After that, you want to head up the middle of the board so that you can grab the Spiritual Power rare node, which gives you bonus core skill damage as well as basic skill damage too. We use both of these in this build, so that's just nice to have. After that, you want to move right along this path over here until you reach the glyph socket. Inside of this, you want to put the exploit glyph. For every 5 dexterity purchased within the range, you deal extra vulnerable damage to targets with that debuff, which is of course really important. It's really nice to stack that. Vulnerable damage is something that we're doing. Vulnerable is a separate multiplier, so it's good to have. This is boosted by the dexterity, so you want to grab all the dexterity that you can within the radius, as well as getting the Harmony rare node specifically, which gives you bonus core skill damage and a little bit of willpower. After that, head out the top side of the board to the board connection gate, and then you want to attach the Thunderstruck board with the legendary power itself in the top left corner. Take this path here to reach the Hubris rare node and also some of the magic nodes around it. This gives you damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, which is great. Again, one of our main goals is keeping enemies vulnerable as much as possible, so this might as well just read damage reduction. Move up from here to get to the glyph socket, and in this one you want to put in the werewolf glyph. This gives you extra damage while in werewolf form, dependent on how much willpower you purchased in the radius, and it also gives you 10% damage reduction in werewolf form if you meet the additional requirement, which is easy to do here. After that, you want to grab the Stormcaller rare node just because you can. This is 20% bonus storm skill damage, as well as a little bit of willpower. Then take the left path out from the glyph socket, head up through the middle so that you can grab the Deluge rare node. This gives you bonus critical strike damage, as well as bonus damage to crowd-controlled enemies. It has 2 separate bonuses from one rare node that are really useful for us. Then continue up along this path that I'm showing you here until you reach the Thunderstruck legendary node itself, which gives you a 30% increase multiplier to crit damage against vulnerable enemies with storm skills, which is really awesome for this build. After that, you want to exit the board by heading back to the Stormcaller rare node that we mentioned earlier, then heading up and right to get to the actual gate. Here you want to attach the Lust for Carnage board, and you want to put the legendary power all the way on the right side of the board. From here, you want to take the upper path that I'm showing you over here to get to the glyph socket, and here you will put in the Spirit glyph. This increases your critical damage with core skills depending on how much dexterity you purchase within the radius, and also has a secondary effect of increasing the damage an enemy will take every time that you get a critical hit against them, which stacks really nicely in this build, and basically just means against tankier enemies you do more damage the more times you crit, and we crit a lot. Mop up the dexterity around in the general area, and also grab the lower rare node here, Feral, to give you 10% bonus werewolf skill damage, 20% if you have more dexterity than me. I'm literally one short of this. That sucks a little bit, but I'll be there real soon, I promise. Then add out the right side here to get to the Lust for Carnage node itself, the legendary node of the board, which makes your critical strikes with werewolf skills, which includes all of our storm skills because of Tempest Roar, restore 2 spirit. So this is just really good for your spirit generation. It means you can throw out more tornadoes, and more tornadoes means more damage, quite clearly. After that, you want to take the upper path away from the glyph socket and just take this path directly to the board attachment gate, where we attach what is likely our final board, which is Heightened Malice, which you want to put in the bottom left corner. Snake up and around like I have here, and then you can slowly just reach the legendary node itself. This makes it so anytime there are 3 or more poisoned enemies near you, you actually deal 45% increased multiplier to your damage, which is a massive increase, and we will often have that many poison enemies nearby as we poison every enemy that we crit, and there's lots of enemies being hit by lots of attacks with high crit chance. After that, you want to head up through the middle of the board here so that you can get to the Toxic Bane rare node. This increases your damage to poisoned enemies, as well as giving you bonus damage with your poison effects. We apply poison, so this is just good in both ways. After that, you just want to snake up and around to get to the glyph socket itself, and in this glyph socket, you'll want to put the Fang and Claw rare glyph, which boosts the power of the magic nodes in the radius, as well as giving you a 12% increase multiplier on your damage to close enemies while you are in werewolf form. After that, just grab the rare and magic nodes in here. It's just a bunch of extra damage, a bit of damage reduction from poisoned enemies. Again, everything will be poisoned, so this is all just really good stats for us that we can get in this radius. After that, you just want to use any extra points that you have remaining to fill in some of the other rare nodes on the boards, the magic nodes that you can get, and then you're done. It's quite the process, I know. The more points that I have to talk about, the more points there is to explain, but you get so many good bonuses from the Paragon board, it's hard to be upset about it in the slightest. With that then, let's just talk a little bit about how to play. Cyclone Armor's active should really only be used if you are taking too much damage from things in melee range. Otherwise, having your enemies grouped up and near you are both ideal. Blood Howl you want to use whenever it is up, as long as that you are in or entering combat, combat. It gets a ton of cooldown reduction from kills, so there's no real negative to activating this really at any point. Hurricane you want to activate on cooldown while you're in combat, just give yourself that little bit of extra damage and damage reduction, and then Claw you want to use whenever you need Spirit, as it now casts 2 basic skills which generate Spirit super quickly. Tornado is your main damage, of course, so just spam it whenever you physically can. It takes care of itself really nicely too. It chooses its own targets, so if you are doing something like just farming XP in Easy Nightmare Dungeon, you can just launch off some tornadoes and then just keep moving past the pack even if they aren't dead yet. The tornadoes will keep dealing damage even if you're not on your screen. There's nothing too fancy about this one, honestly, as far as actually playing it though. It's just a beautiful combination of a ton of synergies coming together to make a nearly perfect build. I hope you've all enjoyed this then. I really like this version of the Tornado Wolf build, adding in Crones and working around Perfect Storm instead of Earth and Might. I feel like it makes the build way more consistent, way better at dealing with combat in general. Sure, its absolute heights are a fair bit lower because you cannot get super lucky Earth and Might procs back to back during Grizzly Rage, but let's all be honest with ourselves. How often were you even getting more than one proc during Grizzly Rage anyways, really? This build still nets a nice solid 40% or even a higher crit chance, especially against injured enemies, so you can get a ton of use out of the same concepts anyways. I really hope you like using this version of the build if you try it out for yourselves, and let me know what Druid builds you want to see either revisited or instead just visited for the first time now that we've had this massive balance patch full of buffs for the lesser played things. Like if you liked the video, subscribe with the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.